Your team third? I got a hydrate to start with. So going to switch over to just chatting. Ouch. So, trying to think of how many streams I've worked in today. Oh, pretty good. I think I'm still lurking in at least 5 streams right now. And then stupid ads play. Get those things out of the way because they bother me. Oh, it says they were random. Okay, cool. That's fine. So 21 minutes before they run again, so it's good, I guess. But yeah, pretty good. Cold. Oh, come on, sound alerts. I don't remember putting Pirates of the Caribbean on there. Yeah, sound alerts is just generally a pain. I wonder why it wants me to go to the site and log in every time before it will let me do anything. Let's see. Claim some browser sources refreshed. I still didn't want to do that one. I don't know why, it just does that first part of it, then it shuts off. Don't know what is causing it. And of course, as soon as I started streaming, I get an alert that I got a tow on them, which I guess I'll answer afterwards. Would you want to be able to look at it and see if you can see what's going on? Now you can actually give people managing access to it. Hey, guilty. I don't know. Maybe you'd see something in the settings that I don't see. I don't know. So I'll go check your outputs. I can't see anything that's set up wrong in it. That's what's bothering me. Oh, that part of it's doing. It's not giving me sound, though. Again, just like the first beat of it. I mean, the Jaws one is like 32 seconds long. Why am I only getting 1 second? Hmm. I don't know. You can't figure out any reason why it just does it. See, that one just enough to start, then it dies. That didn't even play the audio. Nothing sitting in the queue. Unless I just cleared it. I don't know why the first Pokemon message I always get is one leaving instead of one coming in. And I'm thinking about changing my chat and everything else. I just haven't had any ideas on what to do it to yet. But anyway. The hell am I hearing now? Yeah, I was apparently hearing ads from someone else's stream. I don't know what I'm hearing now. Okay. I was hearing some video game. Oh! I know what it was. It was my fireplace running an ad. It's weird when I can say that. Anyway, I guess I really should get into the stories. The first story for tonight, the Musgrave Ritual. An anomaly which often struck me in the character of my friend Sherlock Holmes was that, although in his methods of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, and although also he affected a certain quiet primness of dress, he was none the less, in his personal habits, one of the most untidy men that ever drove a fellow lodger to distraction. Not that I am in the least conventional in that respect myself. The rough and tumble work in Afghanistan, coming on the top of the natural bohemianism of disposition, has made me more rather lax than benefits a medical man. But with here there is a limit, and when I find a man who keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very centre of his wooden mantelpiece, then I begin to find myself virtuous airs. I've always held, too, that police practice should be distinctly an open-air pastime. And when Holmes, in one of his queer humours, would sit in an armchair with his hair trigger and 100 boxer cartridges, and proceed to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic VR done in bullet pox, I felt strongly that neither the atmosphere nor the appearance of our room was improved by it. Our chambers were always full of chemicals and of criminal relics which had a way of wandering into unlikely positions and of turning up in the butter dish or in even less desirable places. There's a good now. But his papers were my great crooks. He had a horror of destroying documents, especially those which were connected with those past cases, and yet it was only once in every year or two that he would muster energy to docket and arrange them, for, as I have mentioned somewhere in these incoherent memoirs, the outbursts of passionate energy when he performed the remarkable feats of which his name is associated were followed by reactions of lethargy, during which he would lie about with his violin and his books, hardly moving safe from the sofa to the table. This month to month of his papers accumulated until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles and manuscripts which were on no account to be burned, or which could not be put away save by their owner. One winter's night we sat together by the fire. I ventured to suggest to him that, as he had finished pasting extracts into his commonplace book, he might employ the next 2 hours in making our room a little more habitable. He could not deny the justice of my request, so that, with a rather rueful face, he went to his bedroom, from which he returned presently, pulling a large tin box behind him. This he placed in the middle of the floor, and squatting down upon a stool in front of it, he threw back the lid. I could not see that it has properly third-fold bundles of newspaper tied with red tape into separate packages. "These are cases enough here, Watson," said he, looking at me with mischievous eyes. "I think that if you knew all that I had in this box, you would ask me to pull out some instead of putting others in." "These are the records of your early work, then?" I asked. "I have often wished that I had notes of these cases." "Yes, my boy. These were all done prematurely before my biographer had come to glorify me." He lifted bundle after bundle in a tender, caressing sort of way. "They are not all successes, Watson," said he, "but there are some pretty little problems among them. Here is the record of the Tarleton murders, and the case of the Vanbury, the wine merchant, and the adventure of the old Russian woman, and the singular affair of the aluminum crutch, as well as a full account of Ricoletti and the clubfoot, and his abominable wife. And here, now this is really something, a little recherche." He dived his arms down into the bottom of the chest and brought up a small wooden box with a sliding lid, such as children's toys are kept in. From within he produced a crumpled piece of paper, an old-fashioned brass key, a peg of wood with a ball of string attached to it, and 3 rusty old discs of metal. "Well, my boy, what do you make of this lot?" he asked, smiling at my expression. "It is a curious collection." "Very curious. And the story that hangs around it will strike you as being more curious still." "These relics have a history, then?" "So much so that they are history." "What do you mean by that?" Yeah. I'll look into it. Sherlock Holmes picked them up one by one and laid them along the edge of the table. Then he reseated himself in his chair and looked them over with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "There," said he, "are all that I have left to remind me of the adventure of the Musgrave Ritual." I had heard him mention the case more than once, though I had never been able to gather the details. "I should be glad, so glad," I said, "if you would give me an account of it." "And leave the litter as it is?" he cried mischievously. "Your tidiness won't bear much strain, after all, Watson. But I should be glad that you should add this case to your annuals, and there are points in it in which we make it quite unique in the criminal record of this or, I believe, of any other country. A collection of my trifling achievements would certainly be incomplete, which contained no account of this very singular business. You may remember how the affair of the Glorious Scot and my conversation with the unhappy man whose fate I told you of first turned my attention in the direction of the profession which has become my life's work. You see me now when my name has become known far and wide, and when I am generally recognized both by the public and by the official force as being a final court of appeal in doubtful cases. Even when you knew me first, at the time of the affair in which you have commemorated in A Study in Scarlet, I had already established a considerable though not very lucrative collection. You can hardly realize, then, how difficult I found it at first, and how long I had to wait before I succeeded in making my headway. When I first came up to London, I had rooms in Montague Street, just around the corner from the British Museum. And there I waited, filling in my too abundant leisure time by studying all those branches of science which might make me more efficient. Now and again cases came in my way, principally through introduction of my old fellow students, for during the last years of my university there was a good deal of talk there about myself and my methods. The third of these cases was that of the Musgrave Ritual, and it is the interest which was aroused by that singular chain of events, and the large issues which proved to be at stake, that I trace my first stride towards the position which I now hold. Reginald Musgrave had been in the same college as myself, and I had some slight acquaintance with him. He was not generally popular among the undergraduates, though it always seemed to me that what was set down as pride was really an attempt to cover extreme natural diffidence. In appearance, he was a man of an exceedingly aristocratic type, thin, high-nosed, and large-eyed, with languid and yet courtly manners. He was indeed a scion of one of the very oldest families in the kingdom, though his branch was a cadet one which had separated from the northern Musgraves some time in the 16th century, and had established itself in western Sussex, where the manor house of Hurlstone is perhaps the oldest inhabited building in the country. Something of his birthplace seemed to cling to the man, and I never looked at his pale, keen face or the poise of his head without associating him with the grey archways and millioned windows, and all the venerable wreckage of that feudal keep. Once or twice we drifted into talk, and I can remember that more than once he expressed a keen interest in my methods of observation and inference. For 4 years I had seen nothing of him until one morning he walked into my room in Montague Street. He had changed little, was dressed like a young man of fashion, he was always a bit of a dandy, and preserved the same quiet, suave manner which he had formerly distinguished. "How has all gone with you, Musgrave?" I asked him, we cordially shaken hands. "You probably heard of my forefather's death," said he. "He was carried off about 2 years ago. Since then I have the course of the Hurlstone estate to manage, and as I am a member for my district as well, my life has been a busy one. But I understand, Holmes, that you are turning to practical ends those powers which you used to amaze us with?" "Yes," said I have taken by living by my wits." "I'm delighted to hear that, for your advice at present would be exceedingly valuable to me. We've had some very strange doings at Hurlstone, and the police have been able to throw no light upon the matter. It is really the most extraordinary and inexplicable business." You can imagine with what eagerness I listened to him, Watson, for the very chance for which I had been panting during all those months of inaction seemed to have come within my reach. In my inmost heart I believed that I could succeed where others had failed, and now I had the opportunity to test myself. "Pray, let me have the details," I cried. Reginald Musgrave sat down opposite me and lit a cigarette, which I had pushed towards him. "You must know," said he, "that though I am a bachelor, I have to keep up a considerable staff of servants at Hurlstone, for it is a rambling old place and takes a good deal of looking after. I preserve, too, that in the pheasant months I usually have a house party, so that it would not be so short-handed. Altogether there are 8 maids, the cook, the butler, 2 footmen, and a boy. The garden and the stables, of course, have separate staff. Of these servants, the one who had been longest in our service was Brunton, the butler. He was a young schoolmaster out of place when he was first taken up by my father, but he was a man of great energy and great character, and he soon had become quite invaluable in the household. He was a well-groomed, handsome man, and splendid forehead, and though he has been with us for 20 years, he cannot be more than 40 now. With his personal advantages and his extraordinary gifts, for he can speak several languages and play nearly every musical instrument, it is wonderful that he should have been satisfied so long in such a position. But I suppose that he was comfortable and lacked energy to make any change. The butler of Hurlstone is always a thing that is remembered by all who visit us. But this paragon has one fault. He is a bit of a Don Juan, and you can imagine that for a man like him it is not a very difficult part to play in a quiet country district. When he was married, it was all right, but since he has been a widower, we have no end of trouble with him. A few months ago we were in hopes that he was about to settle down again, for he became engaged to Rachel Howells, our second housemaid. But he has thrown her over since then and taken up with Janet Tregellis, the daughter of the head gamekeeper. Rachel, who was a very good girl, but of excitable Welsh temperament, had a sharp touch of brain fever and goes about the house now, or did until yesterday, like a black-eyed shadow of her former self. That was our first drama in her house, but the second one came to drive it from our minds, and it was prefaced by a disgrace and dismissal of our butler, Brunton. This is how it came about. I've said that he was a man of intelligence, and this very intelligence has caused his ruin. For it seems to have led to an insatiable curiosity about things which he did not have the least bit of concern. I had no idea of the lengths to which this would carry him until the merest accident opened my eyes to it. I have said that the house is a rambling one. One day last week, on Thursday night to be exact, I found that I could not sleep, having foolishly taken a cup of strong café noir after dinner. After struggling against it until 2 in the morning, I felt that it was quite hopeless, so I rose and lit a candle with the intention of continuing a novel which I was reading. The book, however, had been left in the billiard room, so I pulled on my dressing gown and started off to get it. In order to reach the billiard room, I had to descend a flight of stairs and then cross the head of a passage which led to the library and to the gun room. You can imagine my surprise when, as I looked down the corridor, I saw a glimmer of light coming from an open door in the library. I had myself extinguished the lamp and closed the door before coming to bed. Naturally, my first thought was burglars. The corridors of Hurlstone have their walls largely decorated with trophies. However, he did not appear as was his custom. Oh, skipped a few pages, sorry. Decorations and old weapons. From one of these I picked a battle axe, and then, leaving my candle behind me, I crept tiptoed down the passage and peeped in at the open door. Brunton, the butler, was in the library. He was sitting, fully dressed in an easy chair, with a slip of paper which looked like a map upon his knee, and his forehead sunk forward upon his hand in deep thoughts. I stood dumb with astonishment, watching him from the darkness. A small taper on the edge of the table shed a feeble light which sufficed to show me that he was fully dressed. Suddenly, as I looked, he rose from the chair, and, walking over to the bureau at the side, he unlocked it and drew out one of the drawers. From this he took a paper, and returning to his seat, he flattened it out beside the taper at the edge of the table, and began to study it with minute attention. My indignation at this calm examination of our family documents overcame me so far that I took a step forward, and Brunton, looking up, saw me standing in the doorway. He sprang to his feet, his face turned livid with fear, and he thrust into his breast the chart-like paper which he had been originally studying. "So," said I, "this is how you repay the trust which we have reposed you? You will leave my service tomorrow." He bowed with the look of a man who was utterly crushed, and slunk past with me without a word. The taper was still on the table, and by its light I glanced to see what the paper which Brunton had taken from the bureau. To my surprise, it was nothing of any importance at all, but was simply a copy of the questions and answers and the singular old observance called the Musgrave Ritual. It was a sort of ceremony peculiar to our family, which each Musgrave for centuries past has gone through since coming of age. A thing of private interest, and perhaps of little importance to the archaeologist, like our own blazonings and charges, but of no practical use whatsoever. "We had better come back to the paper afterwards," said I. "If you think it really necessary," he answered with some hesitation. To continue my statement, however, I relocked the bureau using the key which Brunton had left, and I had turned to go when I was surprised to find that the butler had returned and was standing before me. Mr. Musgrave, sir, he cried in a voice which was hoarse with emotion, I can't bear disgrace, sir, and have always been proud above my station of life, and disgrace would kill me. My blood will be on your head, sir. It will, indeed, if you drive me to despair. If you cannot keep me after what has passed, then for God's sake let me give you notice and leave in a month, as if of my own free will. I could stand that, Mr. Musgrove, but not to be cast out before the folk that I know so well. You don't deserve the consideration, Brunton, I answered. Your conduct has been most infamous. However, you have been a long time of the family, and I wish to not bring you public disgrace. A month, however, is too long. Take yourself away in a week, and give what reason you like for going. Only a week, sir? He cried in a despairing voice. A fortnight, say at least a fortnight. A week, I repeated, and you may consider yourself to have been very leniently dealt with. He crept away, his face sunk upon his breast like a broken man, while I put out the light and returned to my room. For 2 days after, this Brunton was most assiduous in his attention to his duties. I made no allusion to what had passed, and waited with some curiosity to see how he would cover his disgrace. On the third morning, however, he did not appear, as was his custom, after breakfast to receive my instructions for the day. As I left the dining room, I happened to meet Rachel Howells, the maid. I had told you that she was only recently recovered from an illness, and was looking so wretchedly pale and wan that I remonstrated with her for being at work. You should be in bed, I said. Come back to your duties when you are stronger. She looked at me with so strange an expression that I began to suspect that her brain was affected. I am strong enough, Mr. Musgrave, she said. We will say what the doctor says, I answered. You must stop work now, and when you go downstairs, just say that I wish to see Brunton. The butler is gone, she said. Gone? Gone where? He is gone. No one has seen him. He is not in his room. Oh, yes, he is gone. He is gone. She fell back against the wall with a shriek after shriek of laughter, while I, horrified at this sudden hysterical attack, rushed to the bell to summon help. The girl was taken to her room, still screaming and sobbing, while I made inquiries about Brunton. There was no doubt about it that he had disappeared. His bed had not been slept in, and he had been seen by no one since he had retired to his room of the night before. And yet it was difficult to see how he could have left the house, as both windows and doors were found to be fastened in the morning. His clothes, his watch, and even his money were in his room, but the black suit which he usually wore was missing. His slippers, too, were gone, but his boots were left behind. Where, then, could Butler Brunton have gone in the night? And what could have become of him now? Of course, we searched the house from cellar to garret, but there was no trace of him. It is, as I have said, a labyrinth of an old house, especially the original wing, which is now practically uninhabited. But we ransacked every room and cellar without discovering the least sign of the missing man. It was incredible to me that he could have gone away, leaving all of his property behind him, and yet where could he be? I called in the local police, but without success. Rain had fallen on the night before, and we examined the lawn and the paths all around the house, but in vain. Matters were in this state when a new development quite drew the attention away from the original mystery. For 2 days, Rachel Howes had been so ill, sometimes delirious, sometimes hysterical, that a nurse had been employed to sit up with her at night. On the 3rd night after Brunton's disappearance, the nurse, finding her patient sleeping nicely, had dropped into a nap in the armchair. When she woke in the morning to find the bed empty, the window open, and no signs of the invalid, I was instantly aroused, and, with the 2 footmen, started off at once in search of the missing girl. It was not difficult to tell which direction she would have gone. Starting under her window, we could follow her footmarks easily across the lawn to the edge of the moor, where they disappeared close to the gravel path which leads out of the grounds. The lake there is 8 feet deep, and you can imagine our feelings when we saw the trail of the poor demented girl came to the end at the edge of it. Of course, we had the drags at once and set to work to recover the remains, but no trace of the body could be found. On the other hand, we brought to the surface an object of most unexpected kind. It was a linen bag which contained within it a mass of old rusted and discolored metal, and several dull-colored pieces of pebble or glass. The strange find was all that we could get out of the mare, and although we made every possible search and inquiry yesterday, we know nothing of the fate of either Rachel Howes or Richard Brunton. The country police are at their end's wit, and I have come up to you as a last resource. You can imagine, Watson, with what eagerness I listened to the extraordinary sequence of events, and endeavored to piece them together, and to devise some common thread among which they might all hang. The butler was gone. The maid was gone. The maid had loved the butler, but had afterwards had cause to hate him. She was of Welsh blood, fiery and passionate. She had been terribly excited immediately after his disappearance. She had flung into the lake a bag containing some curious contents. These were all factors which had to be taken into consideration, and yet none of them got quite to the heart of the matter. What was the starting point of this chain of events? There lay at the end of this a tangled line. "I must see that paper, Musgrave," said I, "which this butler of yours thought it was worth his while to consult, even at the risk of the loss of his place." "It is an absurd business, this ritual of ours," he answered, "but it is at least the saving grace of antiquity to excuse it. I have a copy of the questions and answers here if you care to run your eye over them." He handed me the very paper which I have here, Watson, and this is the strange catechism to which each Musgrave must have had to submit when he came to the man's estate. I will read you the questions and answers as they stand. Who was it? His who is gone. Who shall have it? He who will come. Where was the sun? Over the oak. Where was the shadow? Under the elm. How was it stepped? North by 10 and by 10, east by 5 and by 5, south by 2 and by 2, west by 1 and by 1, and so under. What shall we give for it? That all that is ours. Why should we give it? For the sake of the trust. The original has no date, but is in the spelling of the middle of the 17th century, marked Musgrave. I'm afraid, however, it can be of little help to you in solving this mystery. Yeah. At least, said I, it gives us another mystery, and one which is even more interesting than the first. It may be that the solution of one may be the solution of the other. You'll excuse me, Musgrave, if I say that your butler appears to me to have been a very clever man, and to have had a clearer insight than 10 generations of his masters. I hardly follow you, said Musgrave. The paper seems to me of no practical importance. But to me it seems immensely practical, and I fancy that Brunton took the same view. He had probably seen it before that night on which you caught him. It is very possible we took no pains to hide it. He simply wished, I should imagine, to refresh his memory upon that last occasion. He had, as I understand, some sort of map or chart which he was comparing with the manuscript, and which he thrust into his pocket when you appeared. That is true, but what could he have to do with this old family custom of ours? And what does this rigmarole mean? I don't think that we should have much difficulty in determining that, said I. With your permission, we shall take the first train down to Sussex and go a little more deeply into the matter upon the spot. The same afternoon saw both of us at Hurlstone. Possibly you have seen pictures or read descriptions of the famous old building, so I will confine the account of it to saying that it is built in the shape of an L, the long arm being the more modern portion, and the shorter the ancient nucleus from which the other lies developed. Over the low, heavy linteled door in the center of this old part is chiseled the date 1607. But experts are agreed that the beams and stonework are really much older than this. And enormous thick walls and tiny windows of this part had in the last century driven the family into the building a new wing. And the old one was used now as a storehouse and as a cellar, which it was used at all. A splendid park with the fine old timber surrounds the house, and the lake to which my client had referred lay close to the avenue, about 200 yards from the building. I was already firmly convinced, Watson, that there were not 3 separate mysteries here, but one only, and that if I could read the Musgrave Ritual aright, I should hold in my hand the clue which would lead me to the truth concerning both the butler Brunton and the maid Howells. To that, then, I turned all my energies. Why should the servant be so anxious to master the old formula? Evidently because he saw something in it, which had escaped those generations of country squires, and from which he expected some personal advantage. What was it, then, and how had it affected his fate? It was perfectly obvious to me, on reading the ritual, that the measurements must refer to some spot in which the rest of the document alluded, and that if we could find that spot, we should be in a fair way towards finding out what the secret was of the old Musgraves thought it necessary to embalm it in so curious a fashion. There were 2 guides, even us, to start with, an oak and an elm. As to the oak, there was no question of it. Right in front of the house, upon the left-hand side of the drive, there stood a patriarch among oaks, one of the most magnificent trees that I have ever seen. That was where your ritual was drawn up, I said as we drove past it. It was there during the Norman Conquest, in all probability, he answered. It has a girth of 23 feet. Here was one of my fixed points secured. Have you any old elms? I asked. There used to be a very old one over yonder, but it was struck by lightning 10 years ago, and we cut down the stump. You can see where it used to be? Oh, yes. There are no other elms? No old ones, but plenty of beeches. I should like to see where it grew. We had driven up in a dog-cart, and my client led me away at once, without our entering the house, to the scar of the lawn where the elm had stood. It was nearly midway between the oak and the house. My investigation seemed promising. seems to be progressing. I suppose it is impossible to find out how high the elm was, I asked. I can give it to you at once. It was 64 feet. How do you come to know it? I asked in surprise. Well, my old tutor used to give me an exercise in trigonometry. It always took the shape of measuring heights. When I was a lad, I worked out every tree in the building in the state. This was an unexpected piece of luck. My data were coming more quickly than I could have reasonably hoped. Tell me, I asked, did your butler ever ask you such a question? Reginald Musgrave looked at me in astonishment. Now that you call it to my mind, he answered, Brunton did ask me about the height of the tree some months ago, in connection with some little argument with the groom. This was excellent news, Watson, for it showed me that I was on the right road. I looked up at the sun. It was low in the heavens, and I calculated that it would be less than an hour it would lie just above the topmost branches of an old oak. One condition mentioned in the ritual would be fulfilled, and the shadow of the elm must mean the farther end of the shadow. Otherwise, the trunk would have been chosen as the guide. I had then to find where the far end of the shadow would fall when the sun was just clear of the oak. That must have been difficult, Holmes, when the oak was no longer there. Well, at least I knew that if Brunton could do it, I could also. Besides, there was no real difficulty. I went with Musgrave to his study and whittled myself his peg, to which I tied a long string with a knot at each yard. Then I took 2 lengths of a fishing rod, which came to just 6 feet, and I went back with my client to where the elm had been. The sun was just grazing the top of the oak. I flattened the rod on one end, and marked out the direction of the shadow, and measured it. It was 9 feet in length. Of course, the calculation was now a simple one. If a rod of 6 feet threw a shadow of 9, a tree of 64 feet should throw a shadow of 96. And the line of the one would, of course, be the line of the other. I measured out the distance, which brought me to about the wall of the house, and I thrust a peg into the spot. You can imagine my exultation, Watson, when within 2 inches of my peg, I saw a conical depression in the ground. I knew that this must be the mark made by Brunton in his measurements, and that I was still upon his trail. From this starting point, I proceeded a step, having first taken the cardinal points from my pocket compass. 10 steps with each foot took me along parallel to the wall of the house, and again I marked my spot with a peg. Then I carefully paced off 5 to the east and 2 to the south, which brought me to the very threshold of the old door. 2 steps to the west meant that I was to go 2 paces down the stone-flagged passage, and this was the place indicated by the ritual. Never have I felt such a cold chill of disappointment, Watson. For a moment it seemed to me that there must be some radical mistake in my calculations. The setting sun shone full upon the passage door, and I could see that the old foot-worn grey stones with it was paved very firmly cemented together, and had certainly not been moved for many a long year. Brunton had not been at work here. I tapped upon the floor, but it sounded the same all over, and there was no sign of any crack or crevice. But fortunately, Musgrave, who had begun to appreciate the meaning of my proceedings, and who was now as excited as myself, took out his manuscript to check my calculations. "And under," he cried. "You admitted the and under." I had thought that it meant that we were to dig, but now, of course, I saw at once that I was wrong. "There's a cellar under this, then?" I cried. "Yes, and the old is the house. Down here, through the door." We went down a winding stone stair, and my companion, striking a match, lit a large lantern which stood on a barrel in the corner. In an instant it was obvious that we had come upon the place at last, and that we had not been the only people to visit the spot recently. It had been used for the storage of wood, but the billets, which had evidently been littered on the floor, were now piled in sides, so as to leave clear space in the middle. In this space lay a large and heavy flagstone, with a rusted ring in the centre, to which a thick shepherd's check muffler was attached. "By Jove!" cried my client, "that's Brunton's muffler. I've seen it in it, and could swear to it. What has the villain been doing here?" At my suggestion, a couple of the county police were summoned to be present, and then I endeavoured to raise the stone by pulling at the cravat. I could only move it slightly, and it was with the aid of some of the constables that I succeeded at last in carrying it to one side. A black hole yawned beneath it, into which we peered, while Musgrave, kneeling at the side, pushed down the lantern. A small chamber about 7 feet deep and 4 feet square lay about us. At one side there was a squat brass-bound wooden box, the lid of which was hinged upwards, with a curious old-fashioned key projecting from the lock. It was furred outside by a thick layer of dust, and damp and worms had eaten through the wood, so that a crop of livid fungi was growing on the inside of it. Several metal discs, old coins apparently, such as I hold here, were scattered about the bottom of the box, but it contained nothing else. At the moment, however, we had no thought for the old chest, for our eyes were riveted upon that which crouched beside it. It was the figure of a man, clad in a suit of black, who squatted down upon his hams, with his forehead sunk upon the edge of the box, and his 2 arms thrown out on each side of it. The attitude had drawn all the stagnant blood to the face, and no man could be recognized with that distorted, liver-colored countenance. His height, his dress, and his hair were all sufficient to show my client, when we had drawn the body up, that it was indeed his missing butler. He had been dead some days, and there was no wound or bruise upon his person to show how he had met his dreadful end. When his body had been carried from the cellar, we found ourselves still confronted with a problem which was almost as formidable as that with which we had started. I confess that so far, Watson, I have been disappointed in my investigation. I had reckoned upon solving the matter when at once I had found the place referred to in the ritual. But now I was there, and was apparently as far from ever as knowing what it was which the family had concealed with such elaborate precautions. It is true that I had thrown the light upon the fate of Bronte, but now I had to ascertain how that fate had become upon him, and what part had been played in that matter by the woman who had disappeared. I sat down upon a keg in the corner, and thought the whole matter carefully over. You know my method in such cases, Watson. I put myself in the man's place, and, having first gauged his intelligence, I try to imagine how I should myself have proceeded under the same circumstances. In this case, the matter was simplified by Brunton's intelligence being quite first-rate, so that it was unnecessary to make any allowance for the personal education, as the astronomers have dubbed it. He knew that something valuable was concealed. He had spotted the place. He found that the stone which had covered it was too heavy for a man to move unaided. What would he do next? He could not get help from outside, even if he had someone whom he could trust, without barring the doors and considerable risk of detention. It was better, if he could, to have his helpmate inside the house. But whom could he ask? This girl had been devoted to him. A man always finds it hard to realize that he may have finally lost a woman's love, however badly he may have treated her. He would try, by a few attentions, to make his peace with the girl, Howells, and then would engage her as his accomplice. Together they would come at night to the cellar, and their united force would suffice to raise the stone, so far as I could allow and follow their actions as if I had actually seen them. But for two of them, and one a woman, it must have been heavy work, the raising of that stone. A burly Sussex policeman and I had found it no light job. What would they do to assist? Probably what I should have done myself. I rose and examined carefully the different billets of wood which were scattered around the floor. Almost at once I came upon one that I expected. One piece, about 3 foot in length, had a very marked indentation at one end, while several were flattened at the sides as if they had been compressed by some considerable weight. Evidently, they had been dragged the stone up, and had thrust the chunks of wood into the chink until the last when the opening was large enough to crawl through. They would hold it open by a billet placed lengthwise, which might have become indented at the lower end, since the whole weight of the stone would press down on it, and, on the edge of the other slab. So far, I was on safe ground. And now, how was I to proceed to reconstruct the midnight drama? Clearly, one could fit into the hole, and that was Brunton. The girl must have waited above, when Brunton unlocked the box, handed up the contents presumably, since they were not to be found, and then what happened? What smouldering ring of vengeance had suddenly sprung into flame in this passionate Celtic woman's soul when she saw the man who had wronged her perhaps far more than we had suspected, in her power? Was it a chance that the wood had slipped, and that the stone had shut Brunton into what became his sculpture? Had she only been guilty of silence as to his fate? Or had some sudden blow from her hand dashed the support away and sent the slab crashing down into its place? Be that as it might, it seemed that the woman's figure was still clutching at her treasure trove and flying wildly up the winding stair, with her ears ringing perhaps of the muffled screams from behind her, with the drumming and frenzied hands against the slab of stone which was choking her faithless lover's life out. Here was the secret of her blanched face, her shaken nerves, her peals of hysterical laughter on the next morning. But what had been in the box? What had she done with that? Of course, it must have been the old metal and pebbles which my client had dragged from the mare. Had she thrown them in there at the first opportunity to remove the last trace of her crime? For 20 minutes I sat motionless, thinking the matter out. Musgrave stood still with a very pale face, swinging his lantern and peering down into the hole. "These are coins of Charles I," said he, holding out the first few which had been in the box. "You see, we were right in fixing our date for the ritual." "You may find something else of Charles I," I cried, as the probable meaning of the first two questions of the ritual broke suddenly upon me. "Let me see the contents of the bag which you fished from the mirror." We ascended to his study and laid the debris before me. I could understand as regarding its small importance when I looked at it, for the metal was almost black, and the stones lustreless and dull. I rubbed one of them on my sleeve, however, and it glowed, afterwards like a spark in my dark hollow of my hand. The metalwork was in the form of a double ring, but it had been bent and twisted out of its original shape. "You must bear in mind," said I, "that the royal party made head of England after the death of the king, and that when they last fled they probably left many of the most precious possessions buried behind them, with their intention of returning for them in more peaceful times." "My ancestor, Sir Ralph Musgrave, was a prominent cavalier and the right-hand man of Charles II in his wanderings," said my friend. "Ah, indeed," I answered. "Oh, now, I think that really should give us the last link that we wanted. I must congratulate you on coming into the possession, though in a rather tragic manner. of a relic which is of great intrinsic value, but of even greater importance to the historical curiosity. What is it, then? He grasped in astonishment. It is nothing less than the ancient crown of the kings of England. The crown? Precisely. Consider what the ritual says. How does it run? Whose was it? He who is gone. That was after the execution of Charles. Then, who shall have it? He who will come. That was Charles II, whose advent was already foreseen. There can, I think, be no doubt that this battered and shapeless diadem once encircled the brows of the royal Stuarts. And how came it into the pond? Ah, that is a question that will take some time to answer. And with that I sketched out to him the whole long chain of surmise and of proof which I had constructed. The twilight had closed in, and the moon was shining brightly in the sky before my narrative was finished. And how was it, then, that Charles did not get his crown when he returned? Asked Musgrave, pushing back the relics to the linen bag. Ah, there you may lay your finger upon the one point which we shall probably never be able to clear up. It is likely that the Musgrave who held the secret died in the interval, and by some oversight left his guide and the descendants without explaining the meaning of it. From that day to this it has been handed down from father to son until at last it came within reach of a man who tore its secret out and lost his life in the venture. And that's the story of the Musgrave Ritual, Watson. They have the crown down in Hurlgrove, though they had some legal bother and a considerable sum to pay before they were allowed to retain it. I'm sure that if you mentioned my name, they would be happy to show it to you. Of the woman, nothing was ever heard, and the probability is that she got away out of England and carried herself and the memory of her crime to some land beyond the seas. Honestly, I figured out it was a treasure map. I like the fact that Sherlock Holmes is the one telling the story. Because normally it's Watson. Because Watson is the one who writes down these little adventures. Because Sherlock Holmes clearly had a tendency to throw away his notes. Or burn them. Makes me wonder how many adventures the notes were thrown away for. Or burned. Oh, excuse me for a moment. Anyway, that was our first story for the night. And as I announced in my Twitter post, we were doing 2 of them. Let's see. How long is this one? This one has written notes in it. Interesting. This next one is 23 pages long, so not bad. Getting my stretching and hydrates again. Dashboard, just skip sounds. Dashboard. Check to see if it's working. Wait, let's do that. And that would be a no. Okay, well, try it again later. Our second story for the night. The Reigate Puzzle. It was some time before the health of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes recovered from the strain caused by his immense exertions in the spring of '87. The whole questions of the Netherlands Sumatra Company and of the colossal schemes of Baron Martupers were too recent in mind of the public, and are too intimately concerned with politics and finance to be fitting subjects of the series of sketches. They led, however, in the indirect fashion to a singular and complex problem which gave my friend an opportunity of demonstrating the value of his fresh weapon among the many with which he waged his lifelong battle against crime. On referring to my notes, I see that it was upon the 14th of April that I received a telegram from the Lions which informed me that Holmes was lying ill in the Hotel Dulong. Within 24 hours I was in his sick room and was relieved to find that there was nothing formidable in his symptoms. Even his iron constitution, however, had broken down under the strain of an investigation which had extended over 2 months, during which period he had never worked less than 15 hours a day, and had more than once, and assumed, as he assured me, kept to his task for 5 days at a stretch. Even the triumphant issue of his labors could not save him from reaction after so terrible an exertion, and at a time when Europe was ringing with his name, and when his room was literally ankle-deep with congratulatory telegrams, I found him a prey of the blackest depression. Even the knowledge that he had succeeded where the police of 3 countries had failed, and that he had outmaneuvered at every point the most accomplished swindler in Europe, was insufficient to rouse him from his nervous prostration. 3 days later, we were back in Baker Street together, but it was evident that my friend would be much the better for a change, and the thought of a week in the springtime in the country was full of attractions to me also. My old friend, Colonel Hayter, who had come under my professional care in Afghanistan, had now taken a house near Reigate in Surrey, and had frequently asked me to come down to him upon a visit. On the last occasion he had remarked that if my friend would only come with me, he would be glad to extend his hospitality to him also. A little diplomacy was needed, but when Holmes understood that the establishment was a bachelor one, and that he would be allowed the fullest freedom, he fell in with my plans, and a week after our return from Lyons, were under the Colonel's roof. Hayter was a fine old soldier who had seen much of the world, and he soon found, as I had expected, that Holmes and he had much in common. On the evening of our arrival, we were sitting in the Colonel's gun-room after dinner. Holmes stretched upon the sofa, while Hayter and I looked over his little armory of Eastern weapons. "By the way," he said suddenly, "I think I'll take one of the pistols upstairs with me when I have an alarm." "An alarm?" said I. "Yes, we've had a scare in this part lately. Old Acton, who was one of my country's magistrates, had his house broken into last Monday. No great damage done, but the fellows are still at large." "No clue?" asked Holmes, cocking his eye at the Colonel. "Not of yet, but the affair is a petty one. One of our little country crimes, which must seem too small for your attention, Mr. Holmes, after this great international affair." Holmes waved away the compliment, though his smile showed that it had pleased him. "Was there any feature of interest?" "Why, fancy not. The thieves ransacked the library and got a very little for their pains. The whole place was turned upside down, drawers burst open, and presses ransacked, with the result of an odd volume of Pope's Homer, 2 plated candlesticks, and an ivory letter weight, a small oak barometer, and a ball of twine are all that vanished." "What an extraordinary assortment!" I exclaimed. "Oh, the fellows evidently grabbed hold of everything they get." Holmes grumbled from the sofa. "The county police ought to make something of that," he said. "Why, it is surely obvious that—" But I held up a warning finger. "You are here for a rest, my dear fellow. For heaven's sake, don't get started on a new problem when your nerves are all in shreds." Holmes shrugged his shoulders with a glance of comic resignation towards the Colonel, and the talk drifted away to less dangerous things. It was destined, however, that all my professional caution should be wasted, for the next morning the problem extruded itself upon us in such a way that it was impossible to ignore it, and our country visits took a turn which neither of us could have anticipated. We were at breakfast when the Colonel's butler rushed in with all his propriety shaken out of him. "Have you seen the morning news, sir?" he gasped. "At Cunningham, sir." "Burglary?" cried the Colonel, with his cuffy up half in the midair. "Murder!" The Colonel whispered. "By Jove," said he. "Who's killed then? The J.P. or his son?" "Neither, sir. It was William the coachman, shot through the heart, sir, and never spoke again." "Who shot him, then?" "The burglar, sir. He was off like a shot and got clean away. He just broke in the pantry window when Williams came in, and met his end in saving his master's property." "What time?" "It was last night, sir, somewhere about 12. "Ah, then, we'll step over afterwards," said the Colonel, coolly settling down for his breakfast again. "It's a bad dish business," he added when the butler had gone. "He is our leading man about here, is old Cunningham, and a very decent fellow, too. He'll be cut up through this, for all the man has been through in his service for years, and was a good servant. It's evidently the same villains who broke out into Acton's." "And stole that very singular collection," said Holmes thoughtfully. "Precisely. It may prove the simplest matter in the world, but all the same, at first glance, this is not just a little curious, is it not? A gang of burglars acting in the country might be expected to vary the scene of their operations, and not to crack 2 cribs in the same district within a few days. When you spoke last night of taking precautions, I remember that it passed through my mind that this was probably the last parish in England to which the thief or thieves would be likely to turn their attention, which shows that I have still much to learn. I fancied some local practitioner, said the Colonel. In that case, of course, Acton's and Cunningham's are just the places he would go for, since they are far from the largest around here. And richest. Well, they ought to be. But they've had a lawsuit for some years, which has sucked the blood out of both of them, I fancy. Old Acton has some claim in half Cunningham states, and the lawyers have been in it with both hands. If it's a local villain, there should not be much difficulty in running him down, said Holmes with a yawn. All right, Watson, I don't intend to meddle. Inspector Forrester, sir, said the butler, throwing open the door. The official, a smart, keen-faced young fellow, stepped into the room. Good morning, Colonel, he said. I hope I don't intrude, but we hear that Mr. Holmes of Baker Street is here. The Colonel waved his hand towards my friend, and the inspector bowed. I thought that you would care to step across, Mr. Holmes. The fates are against you, Watson, he said, laughing. We were chatting about the matter when you came in, Inspector. Perhaps you can let us have a few details. As he leaned back in his chair with the appropriate familiar attitude, I knew that case was hopeless. We had no clue in the Afton affair, but here we have plenty to go on. And there's no doubt it is the pretty same party as in each case. The man was seen. Ah. Yes, sir, he was off like a deer after the shot had killed poor William Kerwin had fired. Mr. Cunningham saw him from the bedroom window, and Mr. Alec Cunningham saw him from the back passage. It was 11:45 when the alarm broke out. Mr. Cunningham had just got into bed, and Mr. Alec was smoking a pipe in his dressing gown. They both heard William and the coachman calling for help. Mr. Alec ran down to see what was the matter. The back door was opened, and as he came to the foot of the stairs, he saw two men wrestling together outside. One of them fired the shot, the other dropped, and the murderer rushed across the garden over the hedge. Mr. Cunningham, looking out of his bedroom, saw the fellow as he gained the road, but lost sight of him at once. Mr. Alec stopped to see if he could do anything to help the dying man, so the villain got clean away. Beyond the fact that he was a middle-sized man and dressed in some dark stuff, we have no personal clue, but we are making energetic inquiries, and if he is a stranger, we shall soon find him out. What was this William doing there? Did he say anything before he died? Not a word. He lives at the lodge with his mother, and he is a very faithful fellow. We imagine that he walked up to the house with the intention of seeing that all was right there. Of course, this Acton business has been put everyone right on their guard. The robber must have just burst open the door. The lock had been forced when Williams came upon him. Did William say anything to his mother before going out? She is very old and deaf, and we can get no information from her. The shock has made her half-witted, but I understand that she was never very bright. There is one very important circumstance, however. Look at this. He took a small piece of torn paper from his notebook and spread it out on the table. This was found between the fingers and thumb of the dead man. It appears to be a fragment torn from a larger sheet. If you observe the hour mentioned upon it, it is the very time at which the poor fellow met his fate. You see that this murderer might have torn the rest of the sheets from him, or he might have taken the fragment from the murderer. It reads almost as though it were an appointment. Holmes took up the scrap of paper, a facsimile which here is reproduced. Aye, at 11:45. Learn what may be. Presuming that is an appointment, continued the inspector, it is of course conceivable theory that William Kerwin, though he had the reputation of being an honest man, may have been in league with the thief. He may have met him there, and may have helped him break the door, and then they had fallen out between themselves. This writing is of extraordinary interest, said Holmes, who had been examining it with intense concentration. These are much deeper waters than I had thought. He sank his head upon his hands, while the inspector smiled at the effect which this case had had upon the famous London specialist. Your last remark, said Holmes presently, as to the possibility of there being an understanding between the burglar and the servant, and this note being an appointment from one to the other. It is ingenious and not entirely impossible supposition, but this writing opens up. He sank his head into his hands again, and remained for some minutes in the deepest thoughts. When he raised his face again, I was surprised to see that his cheek had tinged with color, and his eyes as bright as before his illness. He sprang to his feet with all his old energy. I'll tell you what, said he. I would like to have a quiet glance at the details of this case. There is something in it which fascinates me extremely. If you will permit me, Colonel, I will leave my friend Watson and you, and I will step around with the inspector to test the truth of one or two little fancies of mine. I will be with you again in half an hour. An hour and a half had elapsed before the inspector returned alone. Mr. Holmes is walking up and down the field outside, said he. He wants us all four to go up to the house together. To the Cumminghams? Yes, sir. What for? The inspector shrugged his shoulders. I don't quite know, sir. Between ourselves, I think Mr. Holmes has not quite got over his illness yet. He has been behaving rather queerly, and he is very much excited. I don't think you need to alarm yourself, said I. I have usually found that there is method in his madness. Some folk might around here say the madness is his method, muttered the inspector. But he is all on fire to start, Colonel, and we had best go out if you are ready. We found Holmes pacing up and down in the field, his chin sunk upon his breast, and his hands thrust into his trouser pockets. The matter grows in interest, said he. Watson, your country trip has been most distinct success. I have had a charming morning. You've been up to the scene of the crime, I understand, said the colonel. Yes, the inspector and I have made quite a little reconnaissance together. Any success? Well, I've seen some very interesting things. I'll tell you what we did as we walk. First of all, we saw the body of this unfortunate man. He certainly died from a revolver wound as reported. You doubted it then? Oh, it is as well as to test everything. Our inspection was not wasted. We then had an interview with Mr. Cunningham and his son, who were able to point out the exact spot where the murderer had broken through the garden hedge in his flight. That was the great interest. Naturally. Then we had a look at this poor fellow's mother. We could get no information from her, however. She is very old and feeble. And what is the result of your investigations? The conviction that the crime is a very peculiar one. Perhaps our visit now may do something to make it less obscure. I think that we are both agreed, Inspector, that the fragment of paper in the dead man's hand, bearing as it does the very hour of his death written upon it, is of extreme importance. It does give a clue, Mr. Holmes. It does give a clue. Whoever wrote that note was the man who brought William Kerwin out of his bed at that hour. But where is the rest of that sheet of paper? I examined the ground carefully in the hopes of finding it, said the inspector. It was torn out of the dead man's hand. Why was someone so anxious to get possession of it? Because it incriminated him. And what would he do with it? Thrust it into his pocket, most likely, never noticing that a corner of it had left in the grip of the corpse. If we could get the rest of that sheet, it is obvious that we should have gone a long way towards solving the mystery. Yes, but how do we get at the criminal's pocket before we catch the criminal? Well, it is worth thinking over. Then there is another obvious point. The note was sent to William. The man who wrote it could not have taken it. Otherwise, of course, he might have delivered his own message by the word of mouth. Who brought the note, then? Or did it come through the post? I have made inquiries, said the inspector. William received a letter by the afternoon post yesterday. The envelope was destroyed by him. Excellent, cried Holmes, clasping the inspector on the back. You've seen the postman. It is a pleasure to work with you. Well, here's the lodge, and if you will come up, Colonel, I will show you the scene of the crime. We passed a pretty cottage where the murdered man had lived, and walked up the oak-lined avenue in the fine old Queen Anne house, which bears the date of Monteplec upon the lintel of the door. Holmes and the inspector led us around it until we came to the side gate, which is separated by a stretch of garden from the hedge which lines the road. A constable was standing by the kitchen door. "Throw the door open, officer," said Holmes. Now it was on those stairs as young Mr. Cunningham stood and saw the two men struggling just where we are. Old Mr. Cunningham was at that window, the second on the left, and he saw the fellow get away just to the left of that bush. So did the son. They are both sure of it on the account of the bush. Then Mr. Alec ran out and knelt beside the wounded man. The ground is very hard, you see, and there are no marks to guide us. As he spoke, two men came down to the garden path, from round the angle of the house. One was an elderly man with a strong, deep-lined, heavy-eyed face. The other a dashing young fellow whose bright, smiling expression and showy dress were in strange contrast with business with which had brought us here. "So at it, then," he said to Holmes. "I thought you Londoners were never at fault. You don't seem to be very quick, after all." You must give us a little time," said Holmes good-humouredly. "You'll want it," said young Alec Cunningham. "Why, I don't see that we have any clue at all." "There's only one," answered the inspector. "We thought it would be good to find—" "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, what's the matter?" My poor friend's face had suddenly assumed the most dreadful expression. His eyes rolled upwards, his features writhed with agony, and with a suppressed groan he dropped on his face to the ground. Horrified at the suddenness and severity of the attack, we carried him to the kitchen, where he lay back in the large chair and breathed heavily for some minutes. Finally, with a shamefaced apology for his weakness, he rose once again. "Watson will tell you that I have just recovered from a severe illness," he explained. "I am liable to these sudden nervous attacks." Shall I send you home in my trap? Asked old Cunningham. Well, since I am here, there's one point which I should like to feel sure. Can you easily verify it? What is it? Well, it seems to me that it is just possible that the arrival of this poor fellow William was not before, but after the entrance of the burglar to the house. You appear to take it for granted that although the door was forced, the robber never got in. I fancy that was quite obvious, said Mr. Cunningham gravely. Why, my son Alec had not yet gone to bed, and he would certainly have heard anyone moving about. Where was he sitting? I was smoking in my dressing room. Which window is that? The last on the left, next to my father's. Both your lamps were lit, of course? Undoubtedly. There are some very singular points here, said Holmes, smiling. Is it not extraordinary that the burglar, and a burglar who had some previous experience, should deliberately break into a house at the time when he could see from the lights that two of the family were still afoot? He must have been a cool hand. Well, of course. If the case were not an odd one, we should not have been driving you to ask the explanation, said young Mr. Alec. But as your idea is that the man had robbed the house before William tackled him, I think it's a most absurd notion. Wouldn't we have found the place disarranged and missing the things which he had taken? It depends on what the things were, said Holmes. You must remember that we are dealing with a burglar who is a very peculiar fellow, and who appears to work on lines of his own. Look, for example, at the queer lot of things which he took from the Actons. What was it? A ball of string, a letter weight, and I don't know what other odds and ends. Well, we're quite in your hands, Mr. Holmes, said old Cunningham. Anything which you or the inspector may suggest will most certainly be done. In the first place, said Holmes, I should like you to offer a reward, coming from yourself, for the officials may take a little time before they would agree upon the sum. And these things cannot be done too promptly. I have jotted down the form here, if you would not mind signing it. £50 was quite enough, I thought. I would willingly give 500, said the J.P., taking a slip of paper and the pencil which Holmes had handed him. This is not quite correct, however, he added, glancing over the document. I wrote it rather hurriedly. You see, you begin, whereas at about 1:45 on Tuesday morning an attempt was made, and so on. It was 11:45, as a matter of fact. I was pained at the mistake, for I knew how keenly Holmes would feel any slip of the kind. It was his specialty to be accurate to the fact, but his recent illness had shaken him, and this one little incident was enough to show me that he was still far from being himself. He was obviously embarrassed for an instant, while the inspector raised his eyebrow, and Elk Cunningham burst into the laugh. The old gentleman corrected the mistake, however, and handed the paper back to Holmes. Get it printed as soon as possible, he said. I think your idea is an excellent one. Holmes puts a slip of paper carefully away in his pocketbook. "And now," he said, "it really would be a good thing that we should all go over to the house together and make certain that this rather erratic burglar did not, after all, carry anything away with him." Before entering, Holmes made an examination of the door, which had been forced. It was evident it took a chisel or a strong knife had been thrust in, and the lock forced back with it. We could see the marks in the wood where it had been pushed in. "You don't use bars, then?" he asked. "We never found it necessary." "You don't keep a dog?" "Yes, but he's chained on the other side of the house." "When do the servants go to bed?" "About 10. I understand that William was usually in bed also at that hour." "Yes." "It is singular that on this particular night he should have been up. Now, I should be very glad if you would have the kindness to show us over the house, Mr. Cunningham." A stone-flagged passage, with the kitchens branching away from it, led by a wooden staircase directly in the first floor of the house. It came out upon a landing opposite the second, more ornamental stair which came up from the front hall. Out of this landing opened a dressing-room and several bedrooms, including those of Mr. Cunningham and his son. Holmes walked slowly, taking keen note of the architecture of the house. I could tell from his expression that he was in a hot scent, and yet I could not in the least imagine in what direction his inferences were leading him. "My good sir," said Mr. Cunningham, with some impatience, "this is surely very unnecessary. That is my room at the end of the stairs, and my son's is the one beyond it. I leave it to your judgment whether it was possible for the thief to have come up here without disturbing us." "You must try round and get a fresh cinch, I fancy," said the son, in a rather malicious smile. "Still, I must ask you to humour me a little further. I should like, for example, to see how far the windows of the bedrooms command the front. This, I understand, is your son's room?" He pushed open the door. "And that, I presume, is the dressing-room in which he sat smoking when the alarm was given. Where does the window look out to?" He stepped across the bedroom and pushed open the door, and glanced round the other chamber. "I hope that you're satisfied now," said Mr. Cunningham tartly. "Thank you. I think I have seen all that I wished." "Then if it is really necessary, we can go into my room." "If it is not too much trouble." The J.P. shrugged his shoulders and led the way into his own chamber, which was plainly furnished and a commonplace room. As we moved across it in the direction of the window, Holmes fell back until he and I were the last in the group. Near the foot of the bed stood a dish of oranges and a carafe of water. As we passed it, Holmes, to my unutterable astonishment, leaned over in front of me and deliberately knocked the whole thing over. The glass smashed into 1,000 pieces, and the fruit rolled out in about every corner of the room. "Now you've done it, Watson," he said coolly. "A pretty mess you've made of the carpet." I stooped in some confusion and began to pick up the fruit, understanding for some reason my companion desired me to take the blame upon himself. The others did the same and set the table upon its legs again. "Hello," cried the inspector. "Where's he got to?" Holmes had disappeared. "Wait here an instant," said young Alec Cunningham. "The fellow was off his head, in my opinion. Come with me, father, and we will see where he's got to." They rushed out of the room, leaving the inspector, the colonel, and me staring at each other. "Upon my word, I'm inclined to agree with Master Alec," said the official. "It may be the effect of his illness, but that seems to me that His words were cut short by a sudden scream of "Help! Murder! Help!" With a thrill, I recognized the voice of that as my friend. I rushed madly from the room to the landing. The cries, which had sunk into the hoarse, inarticulating shouting, came from the room which we had first visited. I dashed in, and on the dressing-room beyond, the two Cunninghams were bending over a prostrate figure of Sherlock Holmes, the youngster clutching his throat by both hands, while the elder seemed to be twisting one of his wrists. In an instant, the three of us had torn them away from him, and Holmes staggered to his feet, very pale and evidently greatly exhausted. "Arrest these men, Inspector," he gasped. "On what charge?" "That of the murdering of the coachman, William Cohen." The inspector stared at him in bewilderment. "Oh, come now, Mr. Holmes," he said at last. "I'm sure you don't mean to." "Tut, man, look at their faces," Holmes cried curtly. "Never, certainly, have I seen a plainer confession of guilt upon a human countenances." The older man seemed numb and dazed, with a heavy, sullen expression upon his strongly marked face. The son, on the other hand, had dropped all that jaunty, dashing style which had characterized him, and the ferocity of a dangerous wild beast gleamed in his dark eyes and distorted his handsome features. The inspector said nothing, but stepping to the door, he blew his whistle, and two of the constables came at his call. "I have no alternative, Mr. Cunningham," said he. "I trust that this all may be proved to be an absurd stake, but you can see that... Would you drop it? Drop it!" He struck out of his hand, and a revolver which the younger man was in the act of cocking clattering down upon the floor. "Keep that," said Holmes, quietly putting his foot upon it. "You will find it useful at the trial. But this is what we really wanted." He held up the little crumpled piece of paper. "The remainder of the sheet," cried the inspector. "Precisely." "And where was it?" "Where I was sure it must be. I'll make the whole matter clear at the present. I think, Colonel, that you and Watson might return now. I will be with you again in an hour at the furthest. The inspector and I must have a word with the prisoners, but you will certainly see me back at luncheon time." Sherlock Holmes was as good as his word, for about 1 o'clock he rejoined us at the colonel's smoking room. He was accompanied by a little elderly gentleman, who was introduced to me as the Mr. Acton whose house had been seen in the original burglary. "I wished Mr. Acton to be present while I demonstrated this small matter to you," said Holmes, "for it is natural that he should take a keen interest in the details. I'm afraid, my dear Colonel, that you must regret the hour that it took in such a stormy petrel as I am." "On the contrary," answered the colonel warmly, "I consider it the greatest privilege to have been permitted to study your methods of working. I confess that they quite surpass my expectations, and that I am utterly unable to account for your result. I have not yet seen the vestige of a clue. I'm afraid that my explanation may disillusion you, but it has always been my habit to hide none of my methods, either from my friend Mr. Watson or from anyone who might take an interest in them. But first, as I am rather shaken by the knocking, about which I had in the dressing room, I think that I shall help myself to a dash of your brandy, Colonel. My strength has been rather tried of late. I trust you had no more of those nervous attacks. Sherlock Holmes laughed heartily. We will come to that in its turn, said he. I will lay an account of the case before you in its due order, showing you the various points which guided me to my decision. Pray interrupt me if there is any inference which is not perfectly clear to you. It is of the highest importance in the art of deduction to be able to recognize out of a number of facts which are incidental and most or which vital. Otherwise, your energy and attention must be dissipated instead of being concentrated. Now, in this case, there was not the slightest doubt in my mind from the first that the key to the whole matter must be looked at for in the scrap of paper in the dead man's hand. Before going into this, I would draw your attention to the fact that if Alec Cunningham's narrative was correct, and if the assailant, after shooting William Kerwin, had instantly fled, then it would obviously not be that he tore the paper from the dead man's hand. But if it was not he, it must have been Alec Cunningham himself, for by the time the old man descended several servants upon the scene, the point is a simple one. But the inspector had overlooked it because he had stated with supposition that these country magnates had nothing better to do with the matter. Now, I make a point of never having prejudices, and of following docility wherever fact may lead me. And so, in the very first stage of the investigation, I found myself looking a little askance at the part which had been played by Mr. Alec Cunningham. And now I made a very careful examination of the corner of paper which the inspector had submitted to us. It was once clear that it had been formed of a very remarkable document. Here it is. Do you not now observe something very suggestive about it? It has a very irregular look, said the colonel. My dear sir, cried Holmes, there cannot be in the least doubt in the world that it was written by two persons doing alternate words. When I draw your attention to the strong T's and at and to, and ask you to compare them with the weak ones of quarter and 12, you will instantly recognize the fact. A very brief analysis of these four words would enable you to say that the uttermost confidence that the learn and that the maybe are written by a stronger hand, and the what in the weaker. By Jove, it's as clear as day, cried the colonel. What on earth should two men write a letter in such a fashion? Obviously, the business was a bad one, and one of the men who distrusted the other was determined that, whatever was done, each should have an equal hand in it. Now, of the two men, it was clear that one who wrote the at and to was the ringleader. How do you get that? We might deduce it from the moral character of the one hand as compared to the other. But we have more assured reasons than that of supposing it. If you examine the scrap with attention, you will come to the conclusion that the man with the stronger hand wrote all his words first, leaving blanks for the other to fill up. These blanks were not always sufficient, and you can see that the second man had to squeeze to fit his quarter between the at and the to, showing that the latter were already written. The man who wrote all his words first is undoubtedly the man who planned the affair. Excellent, cried Mr. Acton. But very superficial, said Holmes. We come now, however, to a point in which its importance. You may not be aware that the deduction of a man's age from his writing is one which has been brought to considerable accuracy to experts. In normal cases, one can find a man in his true decade with tolerable confidence. I say normal cases because ill health or physical weakness reproduce the signs of old age, even when the invalid is of youth. In this case, looking at the bold, strong hand of one and the rather broken-backed appearance of the other, which still remains its legibility, although the T's have begun to lose their crossing. We can say that the young one was a young man, and the other was advanced in age without being positively decrepit. Excellent! Cried Mr. Acton again. There is a further point, however, which is subtler and of greater interest. There is something in common between these hands. They belong to men who are blood relatives. It may be most obvious to you in the Greek E's, but to me there are many small points which indicate the same thing. I have no doubt at all that the family mannerism can be traced in these two specimens of writing. I am only, of course, giving you the leading results now of my examination of the papers. There are 23 other deductions which would be more interest to experts than you. They all tend to deepen upon the impression of my mind that the Cunninghams, father and son, wrote the letter. Having gotten so far, my next step was, of course, to examine into the details of the crime, and to see how far they would help us. I went up to the house with the inspector and saw all that was to be seen. The wound upon the dead man was, as I was able to determine in absolute confidential, fired from a revolver at the distance of something over 4 yards. There was no powder blackening on the clothes. Evidently, therefore, Alec Cunningham had lied when he said that the two men were struggling when the shot was fired. Again, both father and son agreed as to the place where the man escaped into. At that point, however, as it happens, there is a broadish ditch, moist at the bottom. As there is no indications of boot marks about this ditch, I was absolutely sure not only had the Cunninghams again lied, but that there had never been any unknown man upon the scene at all. And now I have to consider the motive of this singular crime. To get at this, I endeavored first of all to solve the reason for the original burglary at Mr. Acton's. I understood from something which the Colonel told us that a lawsuit had been going on between you, Mr. Acton, and the Cunninghams. Of course, it instantly occurred to me that they had broken into your library with the intention of getting at some document which might be of importance to the case. Precisely so, said Mr. Acton. There can be no possible doubt to their intentions. I have the clearest claim upon half the present state, and if they could have found a single paper which, unfortunately, was in a strong box of my solicitors, they would undoubtedly have crippled our case. There you are, said Mr. Holmes, smiling. It was dangerous, reckless attempt in which I seemed to trace the influence of young Alec. Having found nothing, they tried to divert suspicion by making it appear to be an ordinary burglary, to which end they carried off whatever they could lay their hands upon. That is all clear enough, but there was much that I find still obscure. What I wanted above all was to get the missing part of that note. I was certain that Alec had torn it out of the dead man's hand, and almost certainly that he must have thrust it into the pocket of the dressing gown. Where else could he have put it? The only question was whether it was still there. It was a question in efforts to find out, and for an object we all went up into the house. The Cunninghams joined us, as you doubtlessly remember, outside the kitchen door. It was, of course, of the very first importance that they should not remind us the existence of the paper, otherwise they would naturally destroy it without delay. The inspector was about to tell them the importance which was attracted to it, but by luckiest chance in the world I stumbled upon in a fit, and so changed the conversation. Good heavens! cried the colonel, laughing. Do you mean to say that our sympathy was wasted, and your fit was an impostor? Speaking professionally, it was admirably done, cried I, looking in amazement at the man who was forever confounding me with some new phase of his astuteness. It is an art which is often useful, said he. When I recovered, I managed, by a device which had perhaps some little merit of ingenuity, to get old Cunningham to write the word 12, so that I might compare it with the 12 upon the paper. Oh, what an ass I've been! I exclaimed. I could see that you were commiserating me over my weakness, said Holmes, laughing. I was sorry to cause you some sympathetic pain, which I know that you felt. When we went upstairs together, and having entered the room and seen the dressing gown hanging up behind the door, I contrived by upsetting the table to engage their attention for the moment, and slipped back to examine the pockets. I had hardly got the paper, however, when I was, as I had expected, in one of them, when the two Cunninghams were upon me, and would, I verily believe, have murdered me, but not for your attempt and friendly aid. As it is, I feel the young man's grip on my throat now, and the father has twisted my wrist around in the effort to get the paper out of my hand. They saw that I must know all about it, you see, and the sudden change from absolute security to complete despair made them perfectly desperate. I had a little talk with old Cunningham afterwards to the motive of the crime. He was tractable enough, though his son was a perfect demon, ready to blow out his own or anybody else's brains if he could have got his revolver. When Cunningham saw that was the case against him was so strong, he lost all heart and made a clean breast of everything. It seems that William had secretly followed his two masters on that night that had made their raid upon Mr. Acton's, and having thus got them into his power, proceeded under threats to levy blackmail upon them. Mr. Alec, however, was a very dangerous man to play games with of that sort. It was a stroke of positive genius on his part to see in the burglary scare, which is convulsing the countryside, an opportunity of possibly getting rid of the man whom he feared. William was decoyed up and shot, and had they got the whole of the notes and paid little more attention to detail in their accessories, it is very possible that suspicion might have never been aroused. And the note, I said. Sherlock Holmes placed the conjoined paper before us. It is very much the sort of thing I had expected, said he. Of course, we do not yet know what the relations have been between Alec Cunningham, William Cunningham, and Addy Morrison. The result shows that the trap was skilfully played. I am sure that you cannot fail to be delighted with the traces of heredity found in the P's, and at the trails of the G's. The absence of the I dots of the old man's writing is the most characteristic. Watson, I think our quiet rest in the country has been a distinct success, and I shall certainly return much more invigorated to Baker Street tomorrow. Ooh, that was a long read. Ouch. So, thank you everyone who stayed alert and listened to my various impersonations. Sherlock Holmes is quite fun to try to do the voices for. I'm sorry I wasn't more chatty, Sakuna, but it's hard to do while reading streams. But it is nice to see you around. Maybe I'll see you around in some more of Kayla's streams. I'm still attending to lurk in those when I catch him. But for now, let's see who's possibly on the raid. Ostrich is still going. Yeah, right him. Ostrich is another storyteller. Oh, he's been just chatting most of the evening today. I lurked on him a bit. He's been going 5 hours, so kind of strange to be able to still catch him. I have. Oh, he's about to raid too. I don't know. I want to see who's raiding. Oh, good. He's not raiding me. Okay. So let's see if anyone else is on to raid. Oh wait, raid EB. Is EB on? Yes, EB is still going. Okay, so let's go raid EB. Everyone should have enough points to get the Story Wolf one, the subscription one, if you want to. But that is go check out EB. So have a good night. I will see you tomorrow for Fairy Tales. Bye, everyone.
Oh, shit. Ah. Oh, zap.
They are not going to be agents. Yeah, teaching Sarah how to play art, hanging out, having a great time.
Aw,
Playing out some all this land. It's really fun. Absolutely fun. I'm just out looking for a new guy.
Oh god, I'm gonna die.
Like I just use that for
That's a fire one. I don't like the fire one.
Something up high.
They do that. What the fuck, man? What? What's that smell?
Yeah, we have plenty of people on them. So there's not like a lot of dark server. They do print. I know, it's not very easy.
No. Stop. Right there. Stop what you're doing.
Yeah, we're just out looking for needy guys. Like start breeding.
Not just all those things everywhere.
Serious. Probably is all to confirm. And confirm randomly drive.
I'm supposed to
Randomly is also.
Hitron! Hello! Probably don't smell good. Probably. More than likely. They smell like that plant. And that human. I got to
flying around, you know, vibes. You know.
I don't know.
He died early. He died. See it. Like the really angry almost. That's actually really nice, but like if you say anything, she goes sassy black girl, like black girl. Yeah. That's like the best type of friend to have. Like you always want the sassy black girlfriend, like the sassy black